So welcome everyone to the second series of the Black Voices in Sustainability conversations that are hosted by our firm VC Include, the founder and CEO of VC Include and the Include franchise, Bahia Yasmin Robinson. I really am excited to bring my co-host and partner, business partner, Taj Ahmad Eldridge, to co-host this conversation with leaders in the sustainability and climate justice space. Welcome. I know people are still coming in, but we want to go ahead and get started. So just a little housekeeping rules, and we'll go through a conversation for about 40 minutes or so, but please feel free to put any questions that you have in either the Q&A, section is preferred, but if you will try to scan the chat as well. And also please feel free to say hello in the chat and let us know where you're dialing in from, where you're joining us from. That's always really good to know who's in the room because we'll be doing most of the talking, but we will scan chat and Q&A towards the end of the conversation. I'll try to do it periodically during the conversation just to make sure that we have questions. We might have some real-time questions that just track to our current topic or conversation. So with that, I would like to welcome our panelists by asking each of you to give a brief background on yourselves and your affiliations and how you got into climate investment. And we'll start with Amber J.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone. My name is Amber J. Freeman. I'm CEO and chairperson at Etho Capital. We are a sustainable investing financial technology company focused on identifying climate-based solutions and also companies that have high efficiency relative to their sector peers, both the public equities, primarily public equities at present, but also experience in private equities, and trying to build investment products and portfolios that actually leverage the correlation between climate efficiency operationally at a corporate level and its ability to generate outsized returns for shareholders who are invested in those companies. I've been in financial services for about 15 years, the entire time sustainability focused, sustainability themed. I got my start in private equity, actually, with the Clinton Foundation, the Clinton Global Initiative in New York, and then the Clinton Hunter Development Initiative in Kigali, Rwanda, looking at agricultural industrialization schemes and trying to find investors in European markets for Rwandese shade tree coffee and tea. I realized initially, I thought that I'd be working in sustainable development, international development in particular, trying to figure out how to build economies of scale in developing countries. But I realized very quickly is that any sort of international development project, any sort of NGO initiative or what have you, they were all suffering from the same problem, which is of course access to capital. And I figured the financial markets are where all the capital exists. So why not go there to try and leverage it for the financial and financial gain, but then also environmental and social justice concerns. Prior to my role here at Etho Capital, I was at the Royal Bank of Canada in San Francisco for several years, heading up their sustainable and responsible investment wealth management team as an analyst. And I also worked as a portfolio manager and headed up impact research at Swell Investing. Yeah, thanks, glad to be here.
A good start. I know there's a lot more there, but that's a great start, Amber J. Thank you. Nneka?
Hi, good morning and afternoon, everyone. My name is Nneka Uzo, and I'm calling in from San Francisco. I am the Director of Energy Innovation where at Elemental Accelerator. We're a late-stage tech accelerator investing in teams and in projects. And I'm also the founder of Green Tech More, a network of Black people who are interested in working in climate tech and part of the decarbonization future. I just launched in January and are getting some really great traction. How I got into the world of investing is just through corporate and operational roles. I started my career at NextEra resources, or next to our energy resources, after getting my master's in energy finance, and worked in a variety of roles from power pricing to mergers and acquisitions, natural gas trading, all of those. And after business school, I was thinking more about how do we look at the strategic pieces of the energy infrastructure. And joined Pacific Gas and Electric, worked on a lot of strategy on both the electric and gas sides, and then focused on customer innovation, where I worked a lot with startups and figuring out how the utility could integrate new innovation. That led really well into my role at Elemental, where I support startups with working with large industrials, other utilities, and to do commercial scale projects, and to scale up from pilot.
Wonderful. Last but not, well, Christian, please, actually, Taj.
Sure. Glad to be with everyone. Welcome. Christian Okoye, I'm the Director of Venture Investments at Emerson Collective. For those of you guys who are probably less familiar with Emerson Collective, is a social change organization, investment platform started by Lorraine Jobs. I've been here for about 3 years. I'm part of our environmental and energy venture investment team, looking for-profit businesses that are really able to scale and tackle the challenges of climate change. We invest in everything from circular economy to energy to mobility, ag tech as well. So have really got to touch a lot of different pieces of the puzzle. I started my career in investment banking, covering natural resources, more conventional natural resources, and really during the fracking era, really learning some of the opportunities and the challenges in that space, and then pivoted to building infrastructure projects in sub-Saharan Africa. My family's Nigerian and always wanted to do some of that work. Spent a few years doing large utility scale projects there, and then seeing some of the challenges of using Western dollars, or forcing a Western model on some of these communities, and started to really think about what can innovation do to leapfrog some of those challenges, and really wanted to get closer to the work that was happening in the clean tech space and the innovation side. And so now at Emerson Collective, we really view ourselves as a bridge between innovation and commercial scale deployment, really helping our companies understand the mindsets of institutional capital sources, and be able to really accelerate some of the change that we want to see happen in the world.
Great, and thank you, Christian. And I'll have a tail end of it. My name is Taj Ahmad Eldridge. I serve currently as the Senior Director for Investment at the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator in Los Angeles. And I'm also partners, as Bahia said, in a new endeavor that we'll be announcing soon with Include Ventures. So I'm very, very happy to be here and be one of your co-hosts for this. Quick background, prior to Lacey, I was at the University of California as an accelerator director, focusing on agriculture, clean tech, and the like. Prior to that, I was a founder myself, focusing on the areas of mobile, apparel, consumer, and what have you, and blessed to have 2 X's in the space. And prior to that, I was chief economist for TRW Investments. I was at UBS Investment Bank. I spent a decade at Wells Fargo. So let's get into it if we don't mind. Every time I do Zooms, I have these 2 pictures behind me, which are pictures for my children, and reminds me of the things that we're doing is for the future. But however, being from Texas, one of the things I've seen is that the things we're doing could be for today as well as the future. So for all of you, one of the questions I have is that, considering what's been happening in Texas, both with the grid and the climate that's been happening there as well, do you think that there's been, from a public standpoint, more of an interest and emphasis on the effects of climate change, the effects of the investments that we're making in sustainable markets and sustainable companies, especially for African Americans, given the impact that we've seen in the state? Anyone care to comment there?
I'll take
No
a
one
shot
likes
at
Texas?
it unless Neca wants to. Well, my family's in Texas. I'll take a shot at it. And I've been fielding a bunch of questions. My family knows that I'm in the energy space. And so I think there's a lot of interest in the wonkiness of the grid. What went wrong? Like, why you saw this 10 years ago and it's happening again. And so why haven't we invested in resilience? I think there's, the increasing awareness is great. And I think people are starting to see how it's all tied to climate change. And they're also questioning, how do we build a sustainable grid? Like why aren't we thinking about some of the communities that are hit the most? I think in the future, it gets a little bit scary if you think about folks who can probably afford mini grids and solar and storage and can weather some of these storms and have more resilience, and some folks who may not be able to afford that. And how do you build around that and make sure that folks are not getting caught in the cracks? And I think the growing awareness helps us be more mindful as we start to build a more clean future.
Absolutely. And Nneka, please.
Yeah, I'd support that. I fielded more questions about what is ERCOT now more than ever. But there used to be statistics that the folks in the utility business used to say that people think about their electricity bills like 3 minutes a month. That's no longer the case. People are way more in tune with their electricity usage. They're very familiar with renewables, but they're also familiar with the structures and how they're connected. I think the Texas kind of energy crisis is more of a illustration of the water, energy, and food nexus. We saw that when all of these pipelines froze over, they also affected the water systems, and they were telling people who have no electricity to now, boil their water. And then if you do have food, I guess, how are you going to cook that food, and what sorts of food systems exist? And we talk a lot about food deserts and energy deserts, and all of those things tend to overlap where we have a lot of COVID vaccine deserts. So at the core of everything is, this equity and human dignity piece. I see that there are more social impact investors thinking about this more broadly. Overall, we've seen a lot of traditional investors say that they want to enter not necessarily the impact space, but the climate tech space in terms of solutions that could reduce the exacerbation of the current issues or, be on riding the wave of the next tech boom that's coming with clean tech, mostly because of all these facts that we're seeing as well. But one company of ours that we've been seeing having additional traction is this idea of like climate intelligence, and when is the next 100-year event going to happen? Chances are it's going to happen next week. And, critical infrastructure companies are now taking an approach to say, how do we harden our systems for resilience as well?
Yeah, I think to your point, Nneka, when in the old conversations that we used to have about climate change, environmentalism, and sustainability, it would always be future proofing and looking in the future. We're seeing that these impacts happen now, and there's a need to really address these issues now, especially for Black communities. Amber J, from your standpoint, we've talked about this from both Nneka and Christian from the startup standpoint. What is there anything that might be different when you're looking at the public markets, maybe in the bond sector or anything else on that end?
Sure. When it comes to the public equity space, I think a lot of the best interventions around financing climate solutions or even just sort of social impact usually happens in the debt markets. So with the proliferation of green bonds, such as they are, social impact bonds, and the challenges that are presented when you are using debt instruments to sort of finance these social and environmental goals and objectives. The challenge that I've been seeing in that space in particular is usually around sort of the end use of the proceeds for the bond. I think the proliferation of ESG and impact and sustainable investing in all of its forms has been, a boon in many cases, but it's also allowed in a lot of opacity in the markets in terms of who's actually, adhering to best practices when it comes to the application of these funds and their use. I think that, the bond growth, the growth in the debt markets of these instruments has been tremendous. And I know that there are now, the challenge that we're facing is how to maintain accountability to make sure that the proceeds are being used appropriately. And then of course, there has been some conversation, especially around social impact bonds, where people, even a conversation I was having this morning, where people are saying, okay, well, how is this a debt, or this debt instrument may not produce the returns that we're looking for because it's trying to solve a very specific problem. And it's not really predicated on generating, returns going forward, or, and so that's trying to reconcile those two things. One of the things that I think is missing from the conversation around public debt in general, and just the financial markets in particular, is the role that, and this is going to be a dirty word, but the role that taxes have to play. I think a lot of times people are so focused on trying to find private market solutions to address social problems. And there are some things that the market does very, very well. And then there are some things that governments and sort of like our local, state, what have you, need to do as well, need to sort of, shore up the end case. But when you have a bunch of companies that aren't paying their taxes, right, or the appropriate rate of taxes relative to the income activity that they generate, sort of the economic activity they generate, or the resources that they use, then you end up having these resource constrained governments, which is why you end up having this need for social impact bonds, when really what's needed is a realignment of corporate behavior toward, social and environmental realities. I think this feeling that corporate activity is somehow separate from and divorced from, society is an anachronism of a bygone era, right? What we've seen for centuries at this point is this externalizing of all of the negative consequences of business activity off of corporate balance sheets and into society, and they're internalizing the profits. And what we aim to do, or what we should be aiming to do, is to create this realignment where corporate activity has a cash value, right? Both internal and external. I know another piece of this, and just not to go too far off, but I've been in conversations with impact investors, who do private equity, and the conversations that I always have are, that it always boils down to is around, impact measurement. How do we measure the impact of this investment? How can we actually say that the funds that we're applying are achieving the kinds of outcomes that we want to see? And one person used an example of an affordable housing complex, and they said, well, we have this affordable housing, building. It has, 450 apartments or what have you. And so we were trying to figure out how to count sort of the impact of those 450 apartments, jobs that people are able to acquire and also maintain because they can afford to live in those locations, et cetera. And I said, that's one measure that you can look at. I said, but really, if you want to get a 360 view, and this goes to like renewable energy, it goes to any sort of resource, if you really want to get, a 360 view in the context of affordable housing, you have to look at the opportunity cost of homelessness, right? Because homelessness has costs that society bears, whether it's increased police interventions, emergency room visits, public health consequences as a result of people not having facilities to use, just general hygiene, that kind of thing. All of those things have costs. And so if you're trying to take the total impact of an investment and sort of measure it, whether it's, energy related or social related, you really need to understand sort of the negative consequences or sort of the externalities that corporate activity creates, and then how society bears the cost of those, and then bring that all into alignment. I'll stop there. I won't go into Texas.
That's good. I'm sitting here with a smile on my face because you're talking about the thing that we all have talked about, which is public-private partnerships for the good. One of the things I want to mention, I want to give a hat tip to NECA, a phrase that she's made: climate reparations. Climate reparations is something that some of the corporations need to think about, and I'll let NECA kind of dig into that later on. But I want to continue on this path that Amber J mentioned about the role of government. Last time when Bahia and I did the first series, it was in October. It was prior to the election. We talked about framing sustainability. We talked about the solutions in it. Now we're in a different era. We're in the Biden administration, of course. Biden has also implemented people like Shalonda Baker in climate justice within the administration. From your vantage point, and kind of piggybacking on what Amber J said, for Blacks and sustainability as investors, what do you think has changed, will change now we have this new administration in? There's been some signaling with the addition of Ms. Baker into the Department of Energy. what are some changes that will happen or occur for us as investors or for the investment community here within the administration, with this new administration, I should say?
No one talked too quickly.
I'd say one of the early, it's so interesting. We invested in a company that's doing residential solar, developing residential solar for low to moderate income houses in the US. And last year, nobody didn't really know what the new administration was going to be. There was hesitancy to jump into this market. Fast forward 2 months later, and it's a completely different space. It's red hot. Everybody's knocking on their door, wants to partner with them. I mean, it's just fascinating to see, and some of the institutional capital sources as well, or they just want to flood into the space. And I think the more focus there is in this the sector, the faster a lot of these companies will be able to go. And I do think just even the signaling effect is huge, right? I mean, obviously the ITC extension is great, and to have some more tax incentives out there. But even just having folks in the administration that are focused on equitable access to clean energy, and it's across the board in the administration, not just climate czar. I think that's huge, and I think it really gives investors the confidence that they can invest in this space, that there will be more long-term support, and that it can grow, and that we can start to look at things in a very non-traditional lens, right? Folks are going to pay for their energy bills regardless if their credit score is a 700 or something, right? That shouldn't preclude you from your ability to get access to clean energy and to resilience, right? If you're going to save money, it's going to be better for you and your children's health. And you're not going to have to worry about issues like in Texas, hopefully in the future. Like, I think all of those things were positives, and the administration, the governments, I think everybody's starting to realize that. So it's very exciting to see that alignment coming together.
Totally. And just a place where I can see like policy having like a really strong role here is that historically, philanthropy and government regulatory systems have come into play where the market falls short and fills in that gap. And, we've seen how just some of the rebates for electric vehicles have allowed for, EV cars to become more popular just because now they're at cost parity or slightly cheaper than conventional fuel vehicles, or how we've seen, like the solar and wind markets just flourish because of those tax subsidies that have been around for, more than 10 years or more than 15 years, and trying to figure out like, where is that next place that needs that bump? I mean, we hear a lot of things around like hydrogen and geothermal and like really complicated high-tech technology, but sometimes there's a lot of business model innovation that the business folks or the financial people know about, or financial innovation that I think policy could step in to help out. I mean, things like credit scores for solar financing is a topic that, Steph at Solstice has been thinking about, as well as, like, where are ways that you can make clean energy rebating instead of it's like being a reimbursement where someone has to put up $2,000 first. Just kind of give it out, make it easy, take the friction off it. The money has already been allocated, like get it to the people, get it to the people who are taking the bus to work, get it to the people who don't work 9 to 5, who can't pick up the phone in the middle of the day, get it to the people who have 4 kids at home and, need to use their electricity at a different time than the standard person.
I want to jump in here just with, you guys have all touched on it. I think maybe a couple of you have kind of called it out, but I want to be a little bit more explicit around the term climate justice, right? And what that actually means to you, in terms of a term, because we're all using these different terms, and sometimes it's like nails on a chalkboard, depending on what term you choose to use. But what does climate justice mean, one, and I think two, to you? And do you think that it's the role, this is a little bit of a lead in, of the public or private sector to lead climate justice, initiatives, or just climate justice, methodologies, methodologies, more broadly? Amber J, I feel like you need to take this first.
Yeah, sure. When you said justice, I've actually been struggling with that word a lot because it's been thrown around. It's the, word du jour, after last year.
That's why I brought it up.
And I, I don't particularly care for it as a term, just because, like you said, there's a lot of opacity around it. And what is climate justice or any sort of, social justice look like, depending on your group or depending on sort of your perspective. But when I think about climate justice and what it means to me, as opposed such as it is, for me, it's about making sure that the populations that have disproportionately suffered from the negative consequences of activities, pollution and lack of access to resources, et cetera, are not disproportionately affected or set upon to sort of solve these issues. I'll give an example. The broader, like, global sort of climate change problems that we are trying to address. I'll give you an example. So I was having a conversation actually just this morning about carbon offsets and net zero targets and initiatives.
2050.
And right, to 2050, which, by the way, in case anyone, spoiler alert, super late. It's already too late.
Yeah.
So just want to put that out there. Second, I think that a lot of people are trying to invest in clean energy projects in emerging markets, which is important, right, to stimulate economic growth, et cetera. But they're, in some cases, they're doing it with under the presumption that these countries, which emit, have produced at a, to a lesser degree because they're not as productive, right, depending on how, like, based on how sort of economists sort of define productivity, that they'll be able to allow Western countries to continue to pollute, right? They'll just be able to offset it by, investing in solar panels or tree planting projects in developing countries. And I think that, to me, is the opposite of climate justice, where suddenly it just basically creates a mechanism whereby the same, nations, the same organizations are continue to pollute. They're just able to pay for the luxury of being able to do so without understanding sort of like how this can be disruptive to emerging economies, emerging markets, or poor or low income neighborhoods. So I'm a little suspicious of sort of the transfer, the interplay between who has access. It's the same story. Who has access to capital and the resources in order to proliferate or to sort of scale up whatever project they want, and who suffers the negative consequences of that. And I think climate justice would say, we want to invest in the projects that will help low income communities, emerging market economies, et cetera, grow sustainably, while also reducing our own emissions, while also reducing our own negative impact on the environment, while also controlling our consumption, right? Because effectively, what no one really wants to talk about is that the prevailing economic sort of framework, right, what people call capitalism, and all of its in this form, in its most recently practiced form, is predicated on perpetual growth, but perpetual growth in the face of finite resources, right? And so I think, or rather, perpetual growth in the face of finite resources is sort of a non-starter. Like, how do you do that? And so I think it's really about, for us to see some real justice, we would have to create opportunities, create, equitable and fair financing systems, and also just, access, to build the kind of low carbon economy that we want to see, but without having to overly impact or negatively impact the communities that have already suffered the most from these projects. Yeah, justice is a hard one, but that's sort of how I think about it. You had another question, and I'll try to be fast, quicker.
Yeah,
okay.
No, I want to push it over to Christian
Okay.
and Becca in terms of climate. I mean, this is, again, these words. I mean, we talk about diversity. What does that mean? What is BIPOC? I mean, there's all these terms that I think is nomenclature that for a more general understanding, but even when you talk about impact, I mean, a lot of the questions over the last 5 years that we've got, what does impact even mean, right? Like, what are you actually looking for? So I like to add, like, these are almost simple, stupid, but also the hardest questions to answer, right? Because like, what does climate justice mean to you is a very open-ended question, which is why I like to ask it. So Nneka or Christian, you wanna jump in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a super interesting question. And I think like a lot of these questions are really trying to address correcting for some of the institutional system kind of inefficiencies and failures that we've had over time. And right, so if you think about to Aberjay's point about capitalism, like a lot of the the classic rules of capitalism we just haven't been abiding by, right? We haven't given equal access to opportunity, we haven't given equal access to information, we haven't accounted for all of the externalities, right? All of these things are just coming back to haunt us, and they're hurting the communities they can't afford it, that are most that have the most to lose. And I think that it ends up being one of those things where then over time it leads to social unrest. And then if you think about emerging markets, then you're going to have issues with immigration and migration issues, and like all of those things are going to come back to haunt us, right? So you have to really start to address them now, and you have to think about, okay, well, if we're going to push towards sustainability, we have to make sure that the whole world has, and how do we support the whole world? It's an issue that you can definitely argue that developed markets started, but even if we are moving more towards efficiency, and if we're bringing our carbon emissions down, it is our responsibility to help the other parts of the world and parts of our own community to make sure that they're prepared for resiliency, that they're prepared for adaptation if necessary, and that are also getting their emissions down. And it's a burden that we're all going to have to take on, because for decades we've been at the forefront of rent seeking effectively. Like, it's not been a truly efficient market the way that it's supposed to be, and so now we have reparations to pay, and that's kind of the way that I look at it.
For me, I just look at it simply that like climate is just another, wedge in the level of inputs and outputs that a person experiences in the world. So it could be like health equity or health justice, environmental justice, food justice, all of those. And climate is just a wedge. And the way I've been perceiving like this question or this thought process is like kind of moving from the lens of equality, because I think that's something like people can really easily wrap their heads around, and just kind of move them up the ladder for the quality of human life. So in the story of equality, I give you 1 bottle of water, I get 1 bottle of water. And then when we talk about equity, it's that, I ran a marathon, so I actually need 2 bottles of water, and you can have 1 bottle of water because you've been sitting down for the last hour. So that's kind of getting us to equity. And then, maybe the next part might be justice, that like we should be moving away from plastic bottles. And I want to make sure that we have like a tap, or I have a reusable bottle with me when I'm running, so that I don't have to be out of breath by the time I'm at the finish line. And then eventually you get to this level of what they're calling like liberation, that the system is completely, fixed, so that going forward we've fixed the injustices that have happened right now. And then we're creating a sustainable future that's going to have a virtuous cycle that's going to be better and better. So I think a lot of the energy that we say when we say climate justice, we're really just talking about fixing what was bad that happened in the past. It's such a complicated issue where we're talking about fence line communities or even as a result of redlining many times, that you have Black people who live on the edge of like a coal plant, and now half the community or 80% of the community has asthma, and there's like these crazy cancer things. And then we're hearing people say environmental justice is paying for their health care, right? But the soil is still damaged, the air is not clean, like we still have to do stuff today, right, to bring it up to equity. But then there's issues because, people couldn't breathe very well, maybe they didn't have a chance, they missed 10 days of school a month or something crazy like that, and now they're not getting the same educational accreditations and the same job offers as well. And maybe that community is now, under an overpass or whatever transportation injustice happened there. So what are we going to do to take it to that next level and create, a level of liberation so that it's there's clean air for everyone, there's water flowing for everyone, that communities can thrive and those businesses will be made whole for the future, and that we won't have to deal with this again because we learned from the past.
Yeah. And maybe that's a term that we'll see around more so, like we talked about when we talk about the language of this, is climate liberation instead of climate justice. There's been really interesting things that we've seen in the media standpoint with Soledad O'Brien talking about Dallas as an example on Black Entertainment Television last night, and the effects of what you just mentioned, Nneka, with communities living close to these areas where climate and environment is a huge issue. So definitely that's one of the things that's on there as well.
I mean, I think it's really interesting to look at through levels, to look at kind of equity, justice, kind of liberation, and then all the way up to this virtuous cycle, which I feel like we're starting to, when I say we, I mean kind of humanity, US and abroad, innovators are starting to look at how do you get to a virtuous cycle. But I do want to, I don't think you can have liberation without starting to have the justice. I do think that it's like you have to go through those points to get kind of, almost like, woo-woo, but like, ascension. You have to kind of go through the notches, right, to get to the top. And I wonder, or to go around, if we want to make it more of a recycle kind of, a circle analogy. But I think that it's an interesting way to look at, the life cycle of getting to, how do you create a virtuous cycle by going through equity and justice and liberate, like thinking about it that way. To me feels very clear, because I like to think of network things in phases. And I think I just loved that analogy, Nneka. So thank you for that. Anything to add there on the justice piece? I think what it opens up, and I'm gonna jump into one of the Q&As, and please, for all the attendees, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box. Very helpful for us to kind of weave it into the current conversation. So we have a question around, what are some of the original or less discussed ways in which sustainable investing can help further climate justice, and what ways that don't mirror current inequalities? I'm not sure. What are some original or less discussed ways in which sustainable investing can help further climate justice in ways that don't mirror current inequalities? That's the part. that end part is the thing that makes it a really interesting question.
I can take a stab at it. One of the things that Christian said is that, opportunities are not widely shared. And there's this big thing about access. In general, I will say the investing world or finance is opaque. It's opaque to the general public. It's even opaque to the people who are in this space. Founders are building products, putting their whole hearts into things, and, get rejected every day and sometimes don't get feedback. And, or, people keep trying to, tell them to change the direction of their roadmap in order to fit, a different demographic or population. I think there's one thing that we can say is hey, have resources available to Black founders or founders that are working on solutions to create climate justice. And I keep hearing a lot about, office hours and things like that. I don't think, sometimes they're helpful for some people, and I don't want to speak out of turn, but like being really intentional about like, this is a, financial modeling workshop. We're giving this to you so that when you pitch to whoever, your pitch is just going to be so amazing and flawless, right? And then there's the other part of like, what are the technology types that might have been rejected because of, artificial hurdle rates or artificial barriers that we put on technology. So a lot of funds like to get a return within, 5 to 6 years or some sort of exit. So I've heard of some fantastic solutions that are really around sustainable communities, but don't have that traditional, 10x scale or 3x exit scale that a lot of venture capital firms are looking for. So thinking about like, what are the alternative funding mechanisms that can exist in order to support these founders and these groups, as well as giving them access to ensuring that they get access to world-class facilities, at least in climate tech. A lot of our technology tends to be quite capital intensive, so that, you might need another like $2 million, $3 million plus before you have a product in market. And if you look at the teams that are coming out of these national labs or university labs, they don't look like the fabric of America. So how do we get those, people in the kitchens, people in the backyards, people in the garages working on these projects and getting them access to some of these world-class, leaders and inventors so that they can scale up together? And that's where I think investing can be really creative in that support.
To that point,
Yeah.
NECA and everyone else, there's a question in the chat, I think that really kind of goes to that. One of the people in the chat asked, how are we as investors finding and sourcing these businesses, especially as startups rather, especially those that are owned by people of color? What are some of the tools that we're using? How do we even find some of those founders that can solve some of these issues from the communities that they come from?
I could speak a little bit to that, and I think to NECA's point, I think it is really important that we start to kind of look at different ways of funding, that we look at different ways, different business models. I think there's a lot of technology out there already, and I think it's amazing to always have more technology, but let's deploy more capital. Let's look at innovative business models, ways that we can access more communities, more equitable ways of actually structuring our businesses. And it's specific to your point. I think we're always thinking about, how do we leverage our networks to reach folks who may not traditionally come knocking at our door, right? It's like, I think sometimes you just got to go out there. And went down to a conference in New Orleans to, with Steph Spears actually, to talk community solar, and met a ton of, innovative founders there, right? I think you actually have to go out to the communities. You have to go out and talk to folks. And you got to start really like, you thinking about second, third order of your ecosystem and your networks, and talk to people of color who are more connected to some of these businesses. I think that's really worked for us. We still don't get enough people of color founders. I mean, it's far less than the 20% or the 15% that I would hope it would be. But it is, once I think we're more proactive about it, I think we do find ways to make sure that we're talking to at least a lot of the ones that are out there fundraising.
I would just want to jump in and just talk a bit. I know there's a question about partnerships, but more broadly, partnerships within this space is so key. And I think one of the reasons why that we're really excited to partner with not just Hewlett Foundation and, which is a leader in the space, but also with Green Tech Noir, which NECA just started, is because you're building this network and ecosystem, right, of not just value creators in their own right, but also the network nodes, right? So now we're able to, source better deals, find niche companies, find founders that might be in somewhere in Tennessee where I'm sitting in San Francisco, or, Amber J's in Southern California, Taj is between, Texas and Southern California. And so we're able to start connecting. I mean, one of the things that I didn't talk a lot about VC Include and even Include Ventures, but as a franchise, we're building are those nodes, right? So making sure that the supply chain, not just of capital, but information is connected in a way that serves, asset allocators, asset managers, portfolio companies, and the communities that they live in and that they serve, and looking at how to build a virtuous cycle and sustainable practices throughout at the aggregate of portfolios, at the aggregate of asset managers, because that type of scaling and acceleration is I mean, it's, as Amber J said, 2050, that's not the number. I mean, that's not our goal, right? Even 2040, which I'm part of Ceres and on the President's Council, sustainability and all of that stuff, but they're even dropping it 10 years to say net 2040. But even that's kind of too long, right? And so as we start thinking about, we have to start thinking kind of in, higher at the terms of virtuous cycles. And it's not a next generation issue. It's not, our grandchildren. It is now, it's us. Yep. and potentially affecting our, our children, right? Like it's now. And so I think partnerships in a more general sense, and network effect and network building will allow for the types of tools and tips and resources. We do a lot of training, engagement, et cetera. But that's one part of this question about, how are we sourcing is also tools and resources and tips. And I think looking at Green Tech Noir, looking at VC Include in our climate justice and, fund investment and working capital and things that we're going to be doing over the course of the next decade, looking at Ambergy and Etho and, what they're doing from asset allocation, but also from a knowledge share perspective is really important to kind of follow these nodes so that you have a more comprehensive picture and understanding of where tools and resources are, because we're all kind of disseminating. I mean, the whole point of this conversation is because no one talks specifically about Black voices and sustainability. It's like just wasn't a thing, and it's not to be exclusive, it's to be inclusive, because we're representing our communities right at large. And so if we're investors, asset allocators, and knowledge sharers, then it needs to come from us, right? And not from kind of other sources. And so just wanted to contextualize that a bit, and then jump into wait, that question went away. Sorry. Oh yeah, talking a little bit about, the role of public-private partnerships more broadly, scaling up renewable energy and climate resilience to benefit communities of color. I mean, I guess the question here is, and they said, do you have favorite examples of good public-private partnerships? I think maybe if each one of you can share one or two would be helpful, of like what types of, public-private partnerships you've seen work really well over the last, let's just say 3 to 5 years. I mean, if you want to go as far as 10, that's great. But what comes to mind when you think of like what's worked? Do you feel is starting to move the needle in a particular way? And if it's one thing, that's fine as well. But if it's one or two, it'd be ideal.
I think in the transportation and mobility spaces, I'm seeing like a better use of PPPs that are really, visible. In Hawaii, Elemental has a project with Vicky Bike Share, and that's a big PPP with Honolulu or Oahu more broadly, as well as Secure and the bikes, and just getting people to step away from driving in really dense areas. Additionally, you have, transportation planning providers like Remix, who are rethinking how cities are being designed. And that takes in they're generally, vendors to the city, but thinking about how to use, outside capital and partnering with community-based organizations to make sure that, we're building roadways and we're building bus lanes that actually take people where they want to go. I think because mobility and transportation tends to be so complicated and has so many like interpersonal stakeholders, as well as like regulatory and financial, it's easier for mobility to slide into that really quickly.
I can give some examples, and we typically invest at the corporate level, and I think P3s are usually at the infrastructure at the project level. So I think we'll partner with our companies and help them think about those structures, but we don't invest directly there. But one pretty good example is a company we invested in, Energia, which turns waste into valuable resource streams, whether it's energy or biofuels or fertilizer. They were building their first kind of large infrastructure project, and we helped them get that development started in Rialto, California, which is one of the most polluted areas in the world. And it was great to see them kind of get that project done, partner with the city, get kind of the permits that were necessary. But even bigger than that was really kind of California's mandate for pushing organic waste out of landfills, because that's a huge GHG greenhouse gas emission source. And so, thinking about how do you actually take that, turn that into valuable waste streams, work on decreasing the pollution of these particularly hard hit areas was something that was kind of front and center for this company, and they can partner with the cities. And and help them rethink how they're dealing with their waste.
Yeah, absolutely. I think,
Oh,
yeah,
I didn't know
Jay.
Member Jay
No,
had.
go ahead.
Yeah, no, thanks. You know, like Christian said, I mostly deal on the corporate side of a public, and companies might be engaged in public-private partnerships. I suppose some of the activities I've seen in the past, when I was doing a much more holistic sort of market examination, I suppose, across asset classes, would be sort of water infrastructure projects, right? Where corporations are able to provide and partner with local municipalities and governments to build or sort of improve water infrastructure, right? So that's, I don't have a specific example of a company that I've seen partner, but I know that there are companies, particularly in the US, but I know that there are companies like Xylem that have done these kinds of partnerships in other countries, Qatar, Singapore, et cetera, to try to help. Of course, those aren't developing countries, but try to scale or improve water transfer systems, water distribution, et cetera. I think I would like to see a lot more of that kind of activity, especially in places where people still have to walk for miles to get water, right? Which takes up tremendous amounts of time throughout their day. But then also, of course, we talk about it as if it's a problem that exists somewhere else, but really we have the same challenges when it comes to water purity, water safety here in the United States, as we've seen, not just in Flint, but in other areas as well. And so, and particularly like Native American reservations, et cetera. So it's not like a problem that exists out there, it's a problem that's very present here. And so I think water infrastructure is one where I've seen the most interesting and also very like viable projects. But beyond that, I'm afraid I don't have too many concrete examples.
Yes.
And Bahaya, you asked a question earlier, like what's more important, like the private or the public side tackling? I think it has to be hand in hand, to be honest with you. I do think that, having the right environment, whether it's establishing from the policy side or business and the business environment, I feel like that really enables a lot of these companies to go so much further and faster. And we've seen a lot of that in California, which has been amazing. It's exciting to see more states start to embrace that.
Agreed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think going back to Christian's example, when he talked about that with the company in Rialto, and really kind of highlighting for this question from the audience about circular economy. Do you think the circular economy investments will get to the point where it's less dependent upon charitable resources, especially when you talk about getting into low to moderate income communities, where the short-term needs supersede the long-term investments? Are there any ways to where their circular economy would be, more important or have more impact in the low to moderate income communities because of that? Nneka, what do you think on that end when we're talking about the circular economy and low to moderate income communities?
I think when we're talking about technologies without, intervention, there has to be some sort of parity in cost, or, well, not parity, that's not the right word. I think circular economy can definitely happen. It's all about how do you make it cheaper, faster, better, easier, right? Like it used to be that carrying your own water bottle or a mug to the coffee shop was like not very common, but now, at least here in Northern California, you just see people carrying them everywhere. And it was made cool, like the Swell company and a Corksicle, all these other companies have made it cool. One thing that's awesome about being Black is that we have a high level of cultural capital, right? So we also have the power to make something cool. So if we say that we're all going to be wearing renewable Yeezys that are made out of water bottles, then people are going to be wearing renewable Yeezys made out of water bottles, right? So however, in terms of like more seriously, people are looking for like what's the best solution for their families. I think the everyday regular person doesn't necessarily look at a product and say like, oh, what is this maybe doing for the fish in the ocean? But if they have a choice between a standard general product and one that's organic or one that's helping the environment, and it's either the same price or just a minimal cost, then they're going to take that other choice. I think our society, especially, I keep saying Gen Z especially, don't have an appetite for technology or new tools that are going to do worse for the society than the status quo.
Absolutely. We've seen a lot of that too with the impact of like LeBron James driving an EV, which is going to really kind of influence it. So definitely culture is a part of that and where we see it. Christian or Amberjay, your thoughts on this idea of circular economy towards and how that can be adapted in low to moderate income communities?
Well, I just want to make sure that I understand how you guys are defining circular economy, because when I think of circular economy, I'm thinking about, developing products or solutions or services that are then utilized and then reinvesting those same proceeds or the proceeds from that back into the community. Is that what you're talking about, or is it something different? Because I feel like it's something different.
Well, I think
Yeah.
again, this is one of those, themes that seems like it's different things to different people. And so I think there's no wrong answer. I do want to say we have two minutes, and we could talk about this all day and afternoon. But I was hoping that each one of you in the minute and a half or so that we have, just please leave us with, your top of mind wish for this space. And when I say this space, I mean, folks that are either, investing and wanting to, engage more, Black investors or founders, or, look more differently at what's happening from a climate perspective. What are your last kind of thoughts or wishes there, so that we can end on a high note and look forward to doing this again in April?
Sure. I suppose my hope is that we begin to set more accurate targets for achieving some of our climate goals, and that we stop allowing. I feel like we're negotiating ourselves into sort of like this inaction, or a very slow action situation. And I would just like to see financial market instruments align more closely with our environmental and social needs, at a more piercing pace, a more blistering pace.
NECA, another seconds.
Yeah, so my vision is that, a green energy, green food, clean water is just the bar none, table stakes basic. Like, I want everyone to get it. I want everyone to expect it. And that in the future, we'll be thinking about things to make things like even better, kind of going from that justice to liberation ideology. And in the short term, my goal is for more people to get funding, for us to invest in more outstanding people. And a quick plug for Elemental Accelerator. Our applications are opening this week. We fund up to $500,000 in late stage tech. So please reach out to me if you're interested.
Thank you. I don't know if people can stay on one more quick moment, but Christian, another thought, and then for people that do need to jump off, thank you so much, but we'll wrap up in just one more minute.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to build on everything that they said, just to kind of make sure that those conversations are happening everywhere, right? So whether it's in the boardroom, in a C-suite, whether you're focused on clean energy or not, I do think sustainability is something that's hitting all aspects of our life, all aspects of our business, and equitable access to that clean energy needs to be core to that conversation, because it's otherwise the most vulnerable are going to really suffer, and we're going to have bigger issues years down the road.
Agreed. Well, Taj, please welcome me, and thanking everyone for staying on. For many of you, we really appreciate it. We're looking forward to the next one. Please get in touch with us for more information about these wonderful panelists and for the rest of the work that we're doing in the space. We appreciate you, and thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye.